Hello, sleep seekers. Welcome to episode 2 of our series on Buddhism's complicated relationship with sex, desire, and the body. Last time we met Ikkyu Sojun, the 15th century Zen master who frequented brothels, wrote erotic poetry, and argued that enlightenment doesn't require transcending desire, but accepting it fully, living it honestly, being human without pretense or shame. Or perhaps just rationalizing his preferences with sophisticated Buddhist philosophy, the ambiguity remaining unresolved because reality, unlike our preference for simple stories, rarely provides definitive answers. Tonight we're exploring a broader question. What about the Buddhist traditions that didn't suppress sexuality, but integrated it? That saw desire not as obstacle to enlightenment, but as potential path toward it, that developed elaborate practices using sexual energy for spiritual transformation. These traditions exist, are historically documented, are still practiced today, and they're either profound wisdom about human nature.
Do not escape your desires. True enlightenment is found in embracing them, right here amidst the pleasures of the world.
Or spectacular rationalization for doing what you want anyway, while calling it spiritual practice. Or perhaps both simultaneously, which seems to be the recurring theme of this series. We'll meet the crazy wisdom masters, monks who drank, fought, slept with women, and claimed this was all teaching, all demonstration of freedom beyond conventional morality. We'll explore Tantric Buddhism, which developed specific practices using sexual union as meditation technique, as symbol of non-duality, as method for transforming ordinary pleasure into extraordinary insight. And we'll ask uncomfortable questions about power, about consent, about whether these practices genuinely liberate or just provide religious justification for behavior that, in any other context, we'd recognize as problematic. This will take approximately an hour, which is quite a long time to contemplate Buddhist sexual practices while trying to fall asleep. But hopefully the philosophical tangents and historical details will be sufficiently boring to serve their intended purpose, while remaining interesting enough that you don't feel you've completely wasted your time listening to a man with an English accent discuss medieval monks and their sexual exploits. Let's begin in India, approximately the 7th century, when Buddhism was evolving, fragmenting into multiple schools, developing new practices, and some practitioners were asking, what if we're approaching desire wrong? What if suppression creates the very craving we're trying to eliminate? Part 1. Tantric Buddhism, the Path of Transformation. The sound of a hand drum, damaru, its rhythm irregular, unsettling, used in tantric rituals to represent the pulse of existence, the constant arising and dissolving of phenomena, the heartbeat of reality that continues whether you're enlightened or deluded, practicing or sleeping, alive or approaching death. Tantric Buddhism emerged in India during what's called the Vajrayana tradition, the diamond vehicle or thunderbolt vehicle, around the 7th to 8th centuries CE, though its roots probably go back earlier, mixing Buddhist philosophy with Hindu tantric practices, with folk magic, with esoteric traditions that had existed in India long before Buddhism arrived, creating synthesis that orthodox Buddhists found either profoundly insightful or completely heretical, depending on their tolerance for innovation. The fundamental principle of Tantra is transformation rather than suppression. Instead of trying to eliminate desire, you work with it directly, use its energy, transform it from binding force into liberating force, like taking poison, and through alchemical process, converting it into medicine, the dangerous substance becoming healing substance through skillful means, through understanding its nature deeply enough to work with it rather than against it. This sounds appealing, obviously. You don't have to give up desire, you just have to transform it, is considerably more attractive message than sit in celibacy for decades until desire fades, which is what most Buddhist traditions were teaching, what monks were struggling to accomplish through meditation and discipline, and trying very hard not to think about what they were trying very hard not to think about, which, as anyone who's tried not thinking about something knows, is spectacularly ineffective approach to not thinking about that thing. But tantric transformation isn't licensed to indulge whatever you want while claiming it's spiritual. The practices are complex, demanding, require extensive preparation, are meant to be performed only after years of foundational training in meditation, ethics, and basic Buddhist philosophy. You don't start with Tantra. You start with ordinary practice, sitting meditation, studying texts, following precepts. And only after you've stabilized your mind, understood emptiness intellectually, developed strong concentration, do you receive tantric teachings from a qualified master who's been authorized to transmit them. This is important to emphasize because modern Western Tantra workshops that promise enlightenment through better orgasms have approximately zero relationship to actual Buddhist Tantra, are essentially elaborate sex education courses using exotic terminology to make ordinary pleasure techniques sound mystical. Which isn't necessarily bad. Better orgasms are fine goals, but they're not Buddhist practice, not authentic Tantra, just commercial appropriation of spiritual terminology to sell workshops to people seeking improvement in their sex lives. Actual Buddhist Tantra includes sexual practices, but they're highly ritualized, heavily symbolic, performed with specific visualizations, specific mantras, specific understanding of what's being symbolized and transformed, not just have sex mindfully and call it meditation, which is what most Western adaptations amount to. The deity yoga and sacred union. In Tantric Buddhism, practitioners visualize themselves as deities, not worshipping external gods, but identifying with enlightened beings, taking on their qualities through imagination, through committed visualization that gradually transforms how you experience yourself, how you relate to reality, how you embody wisdom and compassion that these deities represent. Some of these deity visualizations involve male-female pairs in sexual union. Yabyum in Tibetan, meaning father-mother. The male deity representing compassion or skillful means. The female deity representing wisdom or emptiness. Their union symbolizing the non-dual nature of reality, the inseparability of wisdom and compassion, form and emptiness, the apparent opposites that are actually unified, that only appear separate from dualistic perspective that tantric practice is designed to dissolve. The practitioner visualizes themselves as the male deity, visualizes their partner, actual human partner or imagined spiritual consort, as the female deity, and engages in sexual union while maintaining these visualizations, while reciting mantras, while holding awareness of emptiness, while experiencing pleasure not as ordinary sensory gratification, but as manifestation of bliss consciousness, as taste of the enlightened experience that's always present, but usually obscured by conceptual overlay, by the constant mental chatter that prevents direct experience of what actually is. This is extraordinarily difficult. Maintaining complex visualizations while experiencing intense physical sensation requires concentration most people don't possess, even in ordinary circumstances, let alone during sex, when attention tends to fragment, when ordinary consciousness gives way to something more primal, more immediate, less controlled than the focused awareness tantric practice demands. So the sexual practices are advanced, meant for practitioners who've already developed stability through years of non-sexual meditation, who can maintain visualization and mantra even when distracted, who understand emptiness well enough that claiming everything is empty, therefore all actions are equal, doesn't become excuse for ethical violations, but rather deepens ethical sensitivity, recognizes that even if things lack inherent existence, they still cause effects, still create happiness or suffering, still matter in the relative world where we actually live. The practices also traditionally require empowerment. Initiation ceremony, where qualified master authorizes student to engage with these practices, transmits the visualization instructions, explains the philosophy, confirms the student has adequate preparation. You don't just read about it in a book and start practicing. The tradition insists on personal transmission, on relationship with teacher who can monitor your practice, correct misunderstandings, prevent the misuse that happens when powerful practices are approached casually or with wrong motivation. Of course, this requirement for qualified master creates its own problems, which we'll get to shortly, involving power dynamics, trust, and the question of how you know whether your teacher is actually qualified or just claiming qualification while using the role to exploit students, which has happened repeatedly throughout history and continues happening today, despite everyone claiming to have learned from past mistakes. The philosophical justification. The theoretical basis for tantric sexual practices is sophisticated, drawing on Madhyamaka philosophy about emptiness, on Yogacara philosophy about consciousness, on the doctrine of Buddha nature, suggesting that everyone already possesses enlightened awareness, but doesn't recognize it, creating elaborate framework where sexual pleasure becomes not distraction from practice, but expression of practice, not obstacle, but opportunity. The argument goes something like this. Ordinary people experience pleasure and become attached to it, crave it, suffer when they don't have it, organize their entire lives around seeking it and avoiding pain, creating the endless cycle of dissatisfaction that Buddhism is designed to address. Ascetic practitioners try to eliminate pleasure, suppress desire, remove themselves from situations where temptation might arise, creating different problem. The strain of constant suppression, the secret indulgence that inevitably follows, the hypocrisy of claiming transcendence while still being controlled by desire, just controlling it through avoidance rather than through actual freedom. Tantric practitioners propose third option. Engage with pleasure fully, completely, but without attachment, without grasping, maintaining awareness of its empty nature, its impermanence, experiencing it directly while recognizing it's not ultimately real, not solid, not something to cling to, because it's already dissolving even as you experience it, the pleasure and the experiencer both being temporary phenomena without independent existence. This is theoretically brilliant. It's also practically almost impossible for most people, which is why tantric traditions emphasize preparation, prerequisites, the necessity of already having developed stability and insight before attempting to work directly with desire's energy. Because if you try this approach without adequate preparation, you simply indulge desire while calling it practice, convince yourself you're being non-attached while actually being completely attached. Use spiritual terminology to justify ordinary pleasure-seeking, which is what happens in most Western appropriations of Tantra, what probably happened with many Asian practitioners as well, who convinced themselves and others they were performing advanced practice when they were simply enjoying themselves and had good vocabulary to describe it. The test, supposedly, is equanimity. Can you experience intense pleasure without clinging to it? Can you have the experience end without suffering over its ending? Can you engage fully while remaining free? If yes, maybe you're ready for tantric practice. If no, if you're attached, if you suffer when pleasure isn't available, if you organize your life around seeking it, then you're just indulging while calling it something else, and the practice isn't transforming desire, but reinforcing it, strengthening exactly the patterns Buddhism is meant to weaken. But who judges this? How do you know if you're actually non-attached or just convincing yourself you are? The tradition says your teacher evaluates, but your teacher might be wrong, might be corrupt, might be using the same rationalizations you are, creating closed system where everyone agrees they're practicing correctly, while actually just doing what they want and calling it Dharma. This is not a theoretical problem. This is what happened repeatedly, what continues happening, what makes tantric traditions simultaneously profound and dangerous, legitimate spiritual paths and potential justifications for exploitation, depending entirely on the practitioner's actual development and motivation, which are internal states that external observation can't reliably assess. Part 2. The Crazy Wisdom Masters, Freedom or License. Now we meet the really problematic characters, the masters whose behavior was so outrageous that they're either enlightened beyond conventional understanding or mentally ill with good publicity, and the Buddhist tradition has never quite decided which interpretation is correct, instead maintaining both simultaneously, celebrating these masters while also being slightly embarrassed by them, holding them up as examples while quietly suggesting modern practitioners probably shouldn't emulate them too closely. Let's start with Drukpa Kunle, the Divine Madman of Bhutan. Drukpa Kunle, the Divine Madman. Drukpa Kunle lived in the 15th century, same era as Ikkyu. Apparently the 1400s were a particularly good time for scandalous monks, in Bhutan and Tibet, where he's still celebrated, still revered, despite or because of behavior that included using his penis as a teaching implement, literally, calling it his thunderbolt of wisdom, and claiming it had special powers to transmit enlightenment, to subdue demons, to bless people and places through its, shall we say, deployment in various contexts. This is not metaphor. The stories are explicit. He would expose himself to noble ladies, claiming this was teaching about non-duality. He would have sex with women and tell them they'd been blessed. He would point at his erect penis and say, "This is the thunderbolt that destroys illusion," which is either the most profound teaching about emptiness and conventional reality, or the most elaborate justification for sexual harassment ever devised. The hagiographies, the traditional biographies written by devoted students, present all this as enlightened action, as crazy wisdom that transcends conventional morality, as deliberate provocation meant to shock people out of their fixed ideas about propriety and holiness, to demonstrate that enlightenment doesn't look like people expect. That freedom includes freedom from social conventions, including those about sexual propriety. One famous story, Drukpa Kunle visited a monastery where monks were performing elaborate rituals, maintaining strict discipline, following all the rules. He got drunk, urinated in the corner, had sex with a woman in front of everyone, then told them, "Your rituals are empty. Your discipline is hypocrisy. You follow forms without understanding. I've shown you what real freedom looks like, comfortable in this body, comfortable with desire, not pretending to be pure when purity is just another concept to cling to." The monks were scandalized. They tried to expel him. But then, according to the story, he performed miracles, subdued demons, predicted the future, demonstrated powers that convinced them he was genuinely realized, that his behavior was teaching rather than violation, that they were the ones with limited understanding, clinging to conventions while he lived in direct experience of truth. These miracle stories are convenient, obviously. If you can claim miraculous powers, you can justify any behavior. Yes, I appear to be drunk and behaving badly, but I also levitated and talked to spirits. So clearly I'm enlightened, and you should reinterpret what looks like misconduct as actually advanced teaching you're too deluded to understand. This is unfalsifiable. You can't disprove someone's miracles if believers insist they happened. You can't argue someone isn't enlightened if the tradition has already designated them as such. The category of crazy wisdom becomes catch-all explanation for any behavior that would otherwise be condemned, creating perfect excuse for teachers to violate boundaries while claiming it's all intentional. All teaching, all for students' benefit, even when it primarily benefits the teacher. Drukpa Kunli's poems are explicit, celebratory about sex, drinking, and generally doing what he wanted. I am happy to drink wine and sleep with women. My meditation is girls and wine. I have seen the naked face of my own nature. Why should I hide in a monastery? This is either enlightened honesty or spectacular rationalization. The phrase, naked face of my own nature, is Buddhist terminology for direct realization, for seeing reality without conceptual overlay. But it's awfully convenient that his nature involves doing exactly what most men want to do anyway, drinking and having sex with women, while everyone else has to suppress these desires in the name of spiritual plan. Development. Is it possible he genuinely transcended attachment while still engaging in these activities? Theoretically, yes. Buddhist philosophy allows for this. Non-attachment doesn't mean non-engagement. You can do something without being enslaved by it, without suffering when it's not available, without organizing your life around pursuing it. But how do we know the difference between someone who's genuinely free and someone who's genuinely addicted but has sophisticated justifications? External behavior looks identical. Both the free person and the addicted person might drink daily, seek sexual encounters regularly, appear to be driven by desire. The difference is internal. The quality of their relationship to these experiences and internal states are not reliably observable from outside. The tradition resolves this by pointing to results. Enlightened masters produce enlightened students, create positive transformation, demonstrate wisdom in other areas, even if their behavior around sex and alcohol is unconventional. But this is circular. We judge enlightenment by student testimony. But students are often devoted believers who'll interpret everything their teacher does as enlightened action, who've invested years in the relationship and can't afford to admit they've been following a fraud. Drukpa Kunli is still celebrated in Bhutan. Images of his penis appear on buildings painted wooden phalluses, meant to ward off evil spirits, to bring fertility, to honor his memory. Whether this represents reverence for genuine wisdom or a culture that's romanticized, a problematic historical figure is actively debated, with some modern Bhutanese Buddhists uncomfortable with the association, others insisting it's authentic tradition that shouldn't be judged by contemporary standards or Western sensibilities. Marpa, the translator, the angry drunk. Let's meet another problematic master, Marpa Lotsawa, Marpa the translator, who lived in 11th century Tibet and is one of the founding figures of the Kagyu lineage, one of Tibetan Buddhism's major schools, which makes him very important, very respected, and also someone whose behavior was, by conventional standards, terrible. Marpa wasn't celibate, he was married, had children, owned property, lived as householder rather than monk, which was unusual for someone in his position, but not necessarily problematic. Lots of yogis and practitioners maintained ordinary lives while practicing deeply, integrating spirituality with domestic responsibilities, demonstrating that enlightenment doesn't require monastic vows. But Mapa was also famous for having a terrible temper, yelling at students, becoming violent when angry, hitting people, throwing things, generally behaving like someone with serious anger management issues, which seems rather contradictory for someone who's supposedly realized the empty nature of phenomena, who should be maintaining equanimity in the face of provocation, who's teaching others about compassion and wisdom, while demonstrating neither when personally frustrated, drinking heavily. Not social drinking, but serious alcohol consumption, regular drunkenness, the kind that creates behavior problems, that leads to regrettable actions, that suggests dependency rather than occasional indulgence. Mapa apparently drank a lot, frequently, and his students wrote about this, sometimes presenting it as evidence of his unconventional freedom, sometimes clearly uncomfortable with it, but unable to criticize too directly someone they also revered as genuinely realized. Being cruel to his main student, Milarepa, who would become even more famous than Mapa, who's now Tibet's most celebrated yogi, whose story of transformation from murderer to saint is beloved throughout Tibetan Buddhist world. But before Milarepa became saint, he was Mapa's student, and Mapa treated him terribly, making him build stone towers with his bare hands, then destroying them and making him start over, refusing to teach him for years, humiliating him publicly, creating suffering that's rationalized as skillful means, as necessary breaking down of Milarepa's ego, as tough love that produced ultimate realization, but which looks from outside like abusive relationship between teacher with power and student desperate for teaching. The hagiographies present Mapa's anger, his drinking, his cruelty as all being enlightened activity, as intentional teaching, as expressions of crazy wisdom that transcended conventional behavior. When he yelled at someone, he was supposedly manifesting wrathful compassion, using anger as a tool to break through that person's fixed ideas, to shock them into presence, to demonstrate that enlightened beings can express anger without being controlled by it, can use any emotion skillfully without being enslaved by emotion. When he was drunk, he was supposedly demonstrating freedom from conventions about sobriety, showing that alcohol doesn't obscure realization in someone who's genuinely realized, that prohibitions against intoxication are for ordinary practitioners who might lose clarity, but don't apply to masters who maintain clarity regardless of circumstances. When he was cruel to Milarepa, he was supposedly creating conditions for breakthrough, using Milarepa's desperate devotion as leverage to push him beyond normal limits, to purify his karma from having been a murderer in his early life, to prepare him for the realization that eventually came after years of brutal treatment. All of this might be true. The Buddhist tradition says it is, points to Milarepa's ultimate achievement as evidence that Mapa's methods worked, that the cruelty produced results that gentler approaches wouldn't have produced, that Mapa saw what Milarepa needed and provided it, even though it looked abusive, even though it caused tremendous suffering, even though any contemporary assessment would recognize it as a harmful dynamic that shouldn't be defended or rationalized, but condemned. Or, none of it is true. Maybe Mapa was just an angry drunk with abusive tendencies who happened to also be smart, well-educated, knowledgeable about Buddhist philosophy, capable of teaching when he wasn't drunk or angry. And his students rationalized his behavior because they couldn't accept that their teacher was flawed, that they devoted themselves to someone who was partially realized at best, who demonstrated wisdom in some areas while remaining trapped by anger and alcohol addiction in others. The middle position, most realistic position, is probably that Mapa was complicated, genuinely realized in some ways while remaining unresolved in others, capable of profound teaching while also having serious character flaws. His enlightenment real but incomplete. His wisdom genuine but coexisting with unintegrated shadow material that manifested as anger and drinking and cruelty that hurt people, even when it occasionally also helped them. But the tradition doesn't like middle positions. Teachers are either realized or they're not. Behavior is either enlightened action or it's delusion. The category of partially enlightened or realized in some areas but not others doesn't fit the framework, creates uncomfortable ambiguity that people prefer to resolve by choosing one interpretation. Either Marpa was fully enlightened and everything he did was teaching, or he was a fraud and everything was rationalization. Reality is probably messier than either interpretation allows. Tilopa, the fish-eating pimp. Let's go further back to Tilopa, 10th century Indian master who's considered one of the founding figures of the Kagyu lineage. Marpa's teacher's teacher, someone very important in Tibetan Buddhist history, whose enlightenment is not questioned, whose realization is taken as given, whose teachings are still studied and practiced today. Tilopa supported himself by working for a prostitute, not as client, but as basically pimp or manager, handling her business arrangements, dealing with customers, facilitating transactions, which is already ethically questionable, but was his actual livelihood before and even during his teaching career. He also worked as fisherman, catching and selling fish, eating them himself, directly violating Buddhist precepts against killing animals, against taking life, against the first and most fundamental ethical guideline that all Buddhists are supposed to follow. The traditional explanation: Tilopa was so realized that killing fish didn't actually harm them, that his enlightened awareness could transfer their consciousness to better rebirth, that what appeared to be violation of precepts was actually compassionate activity on levels we can't perceive, that he was helping these fish more than he was harming them. This explanation is convenient, impossible to verify, and creates obvious problems. If enlightened masters can kill without it being killing because they're transferring consciousness to better rebirths, then what's to prevent any teacher from claiming this justification? How do we know who can actually transfer consciousness and who's just killing things and making up stories about it? The answer is, we don't. We trust the tradition, trust the lineage, trust that someone somewhere verified this master's realization and wouldn't have designated them as master if they were just making things up. But that trust has been repeatedly violated throughout history, so perhaps it's not reliable. Tilopa also achieved enlightenment, according to the stories, through eating fish. He was working as a fisherman, caught a fish, ate it, and in that moment realized the nature of mind, saw directly into emptiness, achieved complete liberation through the act of consuming another being's flesh, which is about as contradictory to Buddhist values as you can get, while still claiming to be Buddhist. The interpretation: it wasn't the fish-eating that caused enlightenment, it was the complete presence Tilopa brought to the moment, the lack of self-consciousness, the direct experience without conceptual overlay. The same realization that could happen through any activity: meditation, walking, sitting, eating. The fish being incidental, except that the story makes it memorable, makes it shocking, makes it exemplify the teaching that enlightenment isn't found in following rules, but in direct seeing that can occur in any moment, even moments that involve violating the rules. This is philosophically consistent with non-dual understanding. It's also ethically problematic and potentially dangerous, suggesting that precepts don't matter, that breaking them is fine if you're sufficiently realized. that liberation transcends morality rather than deepening it, which opens door to every abuse, every violation justified as enlightened action, every harm rationalized as skillful means. Tilopa taught Naropa, who became famous in his own right, whose teaching story involves Tilopa repeatedly asking Naropa to do outrageous things: jump off cliffs, walk through fire, cut his own wife into pieces, which might be metaphorical, the sources are unclear. Testing Naropa's devotion, his willingness to abandon conventional morality, his trust in his teacher's wisdom, even when the instructions seem insane, dangerous, or morally repugnant. This teaching method is called crazy wisdom, or enlightened activity, or skillful means when it works. When the student achieves realization, when the extreme measures produce breakthroughs that ordinary teaching couldn't produce, when the suffering and danger are retroactively justified by the results. It's called abuse when it doesn't work, when students are harmed, when trust is violated, when teachers use the language of crazy wisdom to justify behavior that's actually just harmful, that serves their desires rather than students' development, that produces trauma rather than transformation. The problem is, these outcomes are only clear in retrospect. While it's happening, the student doesn't know if they're being abused or being taught in unconventional ways. The teacher might not know either, might genuinely believe they're being skillful while actually acting out their own unresolved issues, might confuse their impulses with enlightened intuition, might be unable to distinguish wisdom from rationalization because self-deception is subtle and sophisticated spiritual vocabulary makes it even more subtle. The traditional explanation: Tilopa was so realized that killing fish didn't actually harm them, that his enlightened awareness could transfer their consciousness to better rebirth, that what appeared to be violation of precepts was actually compassionate activity on levels we can't perceive, that he was helping these fish more than he was harming them. This explanation is convenient, impossible to verify, and creates obvious problems. If enlightened masters can kill without it being killing, because they're transferring consciousness to better rebirths, then what's to prevent any teacher from claiming this justification? How do we know who can actually transfer consciousness and who's just killing things and making up stories about it? The answer is, we don't. We trust the tradition, trust the lineage, trust that someone somewhere verified this master's realization and wouldn't have designated them as master if they were just making things up. But that trust has been repeatedly violated throughout history, so perhaps it's not reliable. Tilopa also achieved enlightenment, according to the stories, through eating fish. He was working as a fisherman, caught a fish, ate it, and in that moment realized the nature of mind, saw directly into emptiness, achieved complete liberation through the act of consuming another being's flesh, which is about as contradictory to Buddhist values as you can get while still claiming to be Buddhist. The interpretation: it wasn't the fish-eating that caused enlightenment, it was the complete presence Tilopa brought to the moment, the lack of self-consciousness, the direct experience without conceptual overlay, the same realization that could happen through any activity: meditation, walking, sitting, eating. The fish being incidental, except that the story makes it memorable, makes it shocking, makes it exemplify the teaching that enlightenment isn't found in following rules, but in direct seeing that can occur in any moment, even moments that involve violating the rules. This is philosophically consistent with non-dual understanding. It's also ethically problematic and potentially dangerous, suggesting that precepts don't matter, that breaking them is fine if you're sufficiently realized, that liberation transcends morality rather than deepening it, which opens door to every abuse, every violation justified as enlightened action, every harm rationalized as skillful means. Tilopa taught Naropa, who became famous in his own right, whose teaching story involves Tilopa repeatedly asking Naropa to do outrageous things: jump off cliffs, walk through fire, cut his own wife into pieces, which might be metaphorical, the sources are unclear. Testing Naropa's devotion, his willingness to abandon conventional morality, his trust in his teacher's wisdom even when the instructions seem insane, dangerous, or morally repugnant. This teaching method is called crazy wisdom, or enlightened activity, or skillful means, when it works. When the student achieves realization, when the extreme measures produce breakthroughs that ordinary teaching couldn't produce, when the suffering and danger are retroactively justified by the results. It's called abuse when it doesn't work, when students are harmed, when trust is violated, when teachers use the language of crazy wisdom to justify behavior that's actually just harmful, that serves their desires rather than students' development, that produces trauma rather than transformation. The problem is these outcomes are only clear in retrospect. While it's happening, the student doesn't know if they're being abused or being taught in unconventional ways. The teacher might not know either, might genuinely believe they're being skillful while actually acting out their own unresolved issues, might confuse their impulses with enlightened intuition, might be unable to distinguish wisdom from rationalization because self-deception is subtle and sophisticated spiritual vocabulary makes it even more subtle. Part 3. The Paradox of Desire. Suppression, Integration, or Middle Way? We've now met several masters whose relationship to desire, to conventional morality, to Buddhist precepts was complicated, unconventional, either profoundly wise or deeply problematic, depending on interpretation. Before we drift further into specific stories, let's step back and examine the underlying question. What should Buddhism's relationship to desire actually be? The historical Buddha taught the middle way, avoiding both self-mortification and self-indulgence, neither suppressing desire through painful austerities nor indulging it freely, finding balance between extremes, practicing moderation, following precepts that create boundaries without creating obsession with purity. Part 3. The Paradox of Desire. Suppression, Integration, or Middle Way. We've now met several masters whose relationship to desire, to conventional morality, to Buddhist precepts was complicated, unconventional, either profoundly wise or deeply problematic depending on interpretation. Before we drift further into specific stories, let's step back and examine the underlying question. What should Buddhism's relationship to desire actually be? The historical Buddha taught the middle way, avoiding both self-mortification and self-indulgence, neither suppressing desire through painful austerities nor indulging it freely, finding balance between extremes, practicing moderation, following precepts that create boundaries without creating obsession with purity. But the middle way is vague, allows multiple interpretations, has been understood differently by different schools across Buddhism's 2,500-year history, creating spectrum of approaches from strict celibacy to tantric integration, from complete renunciation to crazy wisdom that apparently includes everything. Let's examine the actual effects of these approaches, looking at what happens psychologically, what patterns emerge, what problems each method creates, even when implemented sincerely by well-intentioned practitioners, the suppression model, and its failures. The dominant Buddhist approach historically has been suppression monastic vows, requiring celibacy, rules against intoxication, emphasis on reducing desire through discipline and meditation. the assumption that liberation comes from wanting less, needing less, gradually freeing yourself from attachment by removing opportunities for attachment to arise. This works for some people, genuinely works. There are monks who achieve peace through celibacy, who find that removing sexual activity from their lives creates clarity, simplifies things, allows them to focus completely on practice, without the complications that relationships introduce, the emotional turbulence, the time and energy required to maintain partnerships while also pursuing intensive meditation. But suppression also creates problems, predictable problems that repeat across traditions, across centuries, across cultures, suggesting these aren't anomalies but inherent issues with the approach. Secret violations. Monks who maintain public celibacy while having private affairs, creating culture of hypocrisy where everyone pretends virtue, while knowing that violations are common, that the official standards are impossible for most people to maintain, that pretense is required even when reality contradicts it. Obsession through prohibition. When something is forbidden, it often becomes more attractive, more present in consciousness, more difficult to ignore. Monks trying not to think about sex often think about sex constantly, the suppression creating the very preoccupation it's meant to eliminate, desire intensifying through resistance rather than dissolving through acceptance, immaturity about relationships and sexuality. People who become celibate monks in their teens or early 20s sometimes never develop adult understanding of relationships, of intimacy, of how to navigate sexual attraction ethically, remaining emotionally adolescent even as they age, capable of sophisticated philosophical discussion, but incapable of healthy relating because they've avoided the experiences that teach those skills. This creates vulnerability. When these monks eventually do violate their vows, which many do, they often handle it terribly, creating exploitative dynamics, harming students, behaving in ways that someone with more relational maturity would recognize as problematic, but which they're blind to because they've spent decades avoiding relationships rather than learning how to engage with them healthily.
The Catholic clergy's sexual abuse crisis is perhaps the most visible example of suppression's failure. Thousands of priests who maintain celibacy publicly while abusing minors privately. The prohibition against normal adult sexuality apparently contributing to development of harmful patterns, though obviously not excusing them. Not suggesting that celibacy causes abuse, but that mandatory celibacy combined with institutional protection and power imbalance creates conditions where abuse is more likely, more hidden, more protected than it would be in systems with different structures. Buddhist institutions have had similar problems, less publicized but documented. Masters abusing students, monastic systems protecting perpetrators, vows of celibacy violated in ways that harm vulnerable people. The idealization of celibacy, creating denial about human sexuality's persistence even in those who vowed to transcend it. So, suppression doesn't reliably work, at least not for everyone, perhaps not for most people, which raises the question, is integration better? The integration model and its dangers. The tantric approach and crazy wisdom approach and Ikkhu's approach argues for integration. Don't suppress desire. Work with it directly, transform it, use its energy. Engage fully while maintaining awareness, finding freedom within experience rather than through avoidance. This sounds healthier than suppression, more psychologically sophisticated, more honest about human nature, more aligned with modern therapeutic understanding that repression creates neurosis, while integration creates wholeness. But integration also creates problems. Rationalization. It's very easy to convince yourself You're engaging mindfully when you're actually just indulging. To claim non-attachment while being completely attached. To use sophisticated spiritual vocabulary to justify doing what you wanted to do anyway. What feels good? What satisfies desire without requiring the difficult work of actually transforming your relationship to desire? Exploitation. Teachers who claim to be practicing Tantra, who say their sexual involvement with students is teaching, who frame relationships with the young, vulnerable devotees as spiritual practice, are often just exploiting power dynamics, using their authority to access sexual opportunities, harming people while claiming to help them, creating trauma while insisting it's transformation. This has happened repeatedly, continues happening, is well documented across Buddhist communities worldwide. Famous
Tonight,
teachers
we're
revealed to have had
different.
affairs with
A
multiple
three-part
students,
series
to have
exploring
manipulated
one of
people
Buddhism's
into sexual
most
relationships using spiritual language, to have caused harm while claiming to be practicing advanced Tantra, to be demonstrating crazy wisdom, to be testing students' attachment, or teaching them about the empty nature of conventional morality. Across Buddhist communities worldwide, famous teachers revealed to have had affairs with multiple students, to have manipulated people into sexual relationships using spiritual language, to have caused harm while claiming to be practicing advanced Tantra, to be demonstrating crazy wisdom, to be testing students' attachment, or teaching them about the empty nature of conventional morality. Some of these teachers were probably sincere, probably believed their own rationalizations, probably convinced themselves they were engaging skillfully when they were actually acting out unresolved desires and calling it Dharma. Others were likely deliberate manipulators, people who saw opportunities for exploitation and used spiritual authority to access them, consciously lying while appearing sincere. The spiritual context providing perfect cover, because questioning a teacher's motivations can be framed as the student's doubt, their lack of faith, their inability to understand advanced practices. The students, almost always young, often female, typically devoted and trusting, are harmed in predictable ways, confused about whether their discomfort is valid or just their ego-resisting teaching. Unable to set boundaries because boundaries can be labeled as attachment, traumatized by experiences that violated their consent but were framed as blessings, spending years working through damage that was inflicted under guise of spiritual development. The problem with integration approaches is distinguishing genuine practice from sophisticated exploitation, actual skillful engagement from rationalized indulgence, real transformation from performance of transformation. External observation can't reliably make these distinctions because behavior looks similar, language sounds the same, and the key differences are internal states that can't be verified, that even the person experiencing them might misinterpret.